We've been talking about how to use Lewis structures to describe the bonding in molecules. For example, in a water molecule, there are four valence electrons around the central oxygen atom. Four of those electrons are in lone pairs on the oxygen, and the other four electrons are involved in bonding between the oxygen and the hydrogen. And we indicate this in a Lewis structure by putting two dots on the oxygen to indicate a lone pair, and to use a line between the oxygen and a hydrogen to indicate the covalent bond um, holding a pair of electrons that connect the oxygen and the hydrogen. And Lewis structures like this one are very useful. They're easy to work with, easy to interpret, but it's important to keep in mind that they are not an accurate picture of what's going on in a molecule like this one. And um, from the point of view of the valence electrons, electrons don't know about atoms or molecules. From the point of view of a valence electron, all it knows is that there are a bunch of positive charges floating around. There are hydrogen nuclei. There's an oxygen nucleus, which with a bunch of core electrons um, tightly bound to it. And so, from the point of view of one of these valence electrons, it just thinks that it's in a very large atom that has a three-part nucleus. And so, just like in an atom, electrons arrange themselves in sort of a cloud-like wave pattern. Electrons in a molecule do the same thing. And this is a more accurate picture of the bonding in a water molecule. But it's not as convenient to work with as a Lewis structure. And there are some molecules where Lewis structures really don't work very well to capture the essential bonding that's going on. And we're going to look at one of these, and we're going to develop a tale of three molecules and compare three molecules with similar bonding situations. Hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, where there are two oxygen atoms connected by a single bond. And then ozone, O3, where in this Lewis structure we've got two oxygens connected by a single bond and two oxygens connected by a double bond. And then molecular oxygen, O2, where we have two oxygen atoms connected by a double bond in the Lewis structure. And all of these Lewis structures are perfectly good. They satisfy the octet rule. Each of the oxygen atoms has a full 8 electrons surrounding it in a combination of lone pairs and bonding pairs. And so from that point of view, all of the oxygen atoms are happy. But we can start to see that there's something wrong with these pictures if we actually look at how long the bonds are between the oxygen atoms. So in hydrogen peroxide, the two oxygen atoms are 149 picometers apart. In O2, the oxygen atoms are closer together. They're 121 picometers apart. And that kind of makes sense. In O2, there are two bonding pairs, two pairs of electrons that are holding the atoms together. And so it stands to reason that with two pairs of electrons holding the atoms together, they'd be held more tightly and they'd be pulled closer together. And that's exactly what we see. The double bond in O2 is shorter than the single bond in H2O2. Now, if the Lewis structures were an accurate representation of reality, then we would expect to see that in ozone, one of the oxygen-oxygen bonds would be fairly long, close to 149 picometers, and one of the oxygen-oxygen bonds would be shorter, about 121 picometers. But in fact, when we measure the bond lengths in ozone, what we find is that each of those oxygen-oxygen bonds is the same. They're both 128 picometers long, which is sort of in between the single bond distance and the double bond distance. And so it's the oxygen-oxygen bonds in ozone sort of seem like they're somewhere between a single bond and a double bond. And one way that we could try modifying the Lewis structure to reflect this would be if we first of all remind ourselves that that each of these bonds is a pair of electrons being shared, and so if we explicitly write in the two electrons in the second bond on the right here, we could imagine moving one of those electrons over, and the middle oxygen is still happy. It still has a full octet of valence electrons around it. The oxygen on the right is now short an electron. It only has 7 valence electrons. The oxygen on the left now has 9 valence electrons. But we can fix that by just moving one of the valence electrons from the left-hand side all the way over to the right. And so now each of the oxygen atoms in ozone has 8 electrons around it, and so they are happy as far as that goes. And so this gives us a picture of ozone where now both of the oxygen-oxygen bonds are identical, and they're intermediate between a single bond and a double bond. They each have 1.5 pairs of bonding electrons. And this is a reasonably good way to describe the bonding in ozone. But this kind of picture gets harder to use with more complicated molecules. So for instance, SO3, sulfur trioxide, is a molecule where there are 3 identical bonds between sulfur and oxygen, and each bond acts as though it were 1 1/3 bonding pairs. And it's hard to split up pairs of electrons so that you get 1 1/3 pairs in between atoms. So mucking around with the Lewis structures is kind of awkward. And so what we actually do is, rather than trying to indicate half bonds with just single electrons shown on a Lewis diagram, a different approach is taken. So if I erase this guy and reproduce the standard Lewis structure that I've got above, notice that in this picture we've got a single bond on the left of the molecule and a double bond on the right. There's no reason why the bonds have to be in those positions. We could just as easily draw this picture with a double bond on the left and a single bond on the right. And if we draw both of these, we can say that oxygen has elements of, or has aspects of, both of these Lewis structures. And this is what we do. We say that we use both of these Lewis structures to represent ozone, and we say that that ozone experiences resonance, and that it has these 2 resonance forms. Now, one thing that we need to be clear on is that we're not saying that ozone is flipping back and forth between these 2 pictures here, between having the double bond on the right and the double bond on the left. Actually, what we're saying is that the ozone molecule is sort of an average of these 2 Lewis structures, of these 2 resonance forms. And it's sort of a hybrid, if you will, of these 2 pictures. And another thing that's going on in a resonance picture like this is that we've got some electrons are lone pairs that are localized on a single atom. Some of the electrons are bonding pairs that are being shared between 2 atoms. But 4 of the electrons in this picture, and here I'm highlighting them in red, are actually being shared by all 3 of the oxygen atoms. And we indicate that by putting them in different positions in the 2 resonance forms. And these electrons that are being shared by more than 2 atoms are said to be delocalized. So we've got 4 electrons that are delocalized across all 3 oxygen atoms in ozone. And then another thing that we can get from a picture like this is that each of the oxygen-oxygen bonds in ozone is identical, and each one is an average of a single bond and a double bond. So each of those oxygen-oxygen bonds is behaving as 1.5 bonds. So hydrogen peroxide has a single bond between oxygen atoms. O2 has a double bond between oxygen atoms. Ozone has 1.5 bonds between the oxygen atoms on the left and 1.5 bonds between the oxygen atoms on the right. We can do a similar kind of picture with sulfur trioxide. So in SO3, the standard Lewis structure would have 2 SO single bonds and 1 SO double bond, but there's no reason why that double bond has to be written in the upper position. It could just as well be written down and to the right, or down and to the left. And each of these 3 Lewis structures is equally good, and we say that each of these Lewis structures is a resonance form of SO3, but the SO3 molecule is an average of the 3 structures. And so each of the SO bonds in this molecule is identical, and if we compare the different resonance forms, if we look, say, at the sulfur and the oxygen in the top of the picture, on average, we've got 1 1/3 bonds between the sulfur and that oxygen. Likewise, we have an average of 1 1/3 bonds between the sulfur and the oxygen on the lower left, and we have 1 1/3 bonds between the sulfur and the oxygen on the lower right. Another very famous example of a molecule that is best described using resonance like this is benzene, which has the formula C6H6. And if you wanted to draw a Lewis structure for this, you would have a ring of 6 carbon atoms with alternating single and double bonds. But there are 2 different ways that you could arrange the alternating bonds. You could have them in this arrangement, or you could have them in this arrangement. And so we say that benzene is not in either one of these individual Lewis structures, but instead it's an average of the 2. It experiences resonance. There are 2 resonance forms for benzene, and each of the carbon-carbon bonds is described by an average of these 2 pictures. So for instance, if we look at these 2 carbon atoms here, in the resonance form on the left, they're represented by a single bond. In the form on the right, they're represented by a double bond. And so on average, that particular carbon-carbon bond has 1.5 bonds in between them. And so these resonance structures can be awkward to work with. They're kind of hard to wrap your head around, but they are able to describe bonding in molecules where you've got electrons that are that don't neatly fit into this localized picture of either a lone pair on one atom or a bonding pair that's just between 2 atoms. In these resonance structures, you have electrons that are spread out across multiple atoms, and these resonance forms are one way to describe a picture like that.